Hi, this is Pastor Tim. Welcome to this week's study guide. We conclude our series, Insecure No More. And I got to tell you, most people have some insecurities, me included, and we need to get rid of those because remember, they hinder us from relationships with one another, they keep us from fulfilling our purpose in Christ, and they dishonor God because He made us fearfully and wonderfully. We want to overcome those. So this week's message is the final in that series. And again, we started it off by visiting David's life. We ended by visiting David's life. David's life was one that could have been marked by insecurities because think about it. He was put down by his brothers. He was put down by Goliath. He was put down by Saul. And you can go down the list of the things that he had to overcome. And if he would have listened to any of those, he would have been ineffective. He would never have accomplished what God wanted him to accomplish. So certainly we talked about that in this message. But let's just take a few questions from this message. Take a little time and engage with these. Let's start with question number 1. What did David have to overcome with his brothers? And has that problem ever affected you? And if so, how? What did David have to overcome with his brothers? Has that ever affected you? And if so, how? David's brothers insulted David. They talked about how he was little, how he was the least. Now listen, the least is different from the youngest. And we need to make sure that we understand the differentiation. They were saying that he was less than. Just because he was younger didn't make him less than. We understand that he was of ruddy appearance. That doesn't necessarily mean really handsome. But David didn't listen. If he did, Israel would have still been under the control of the Philistines. David ignored that from his brothers. Now sometimes the ones that sting the most are the insults, the put-downs, and the comparisons that come within our own family. If you think about Joseph, he was loved by his father, hated by his brothers because they were jealous of him. And so we understand that these comparisons can really bring pain. They can really affect our lives. In what way have comparisons in your family affected you? And I hope you're overcoming them. That leads us to question number 2. What kind of comparisons did David receive from the giant? How did David overcome these comparisons? And again, how does this apply to your life? If you remember, David was insulted greatly by this giant. And of course, compared to the giant, David didn't have any power. He was nothing in the sight of this guy that was 9 foot tall. But don't forget that David defeated Goliath. You see, when you compare yourself according to stature, size, looks, all those other things, you are using a different standard than what God uses. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But David had to overcome those insults. And so David couldn't lift the sword, but he could certainly throw a stone. Listen, there's a lesson there for you and me. We can't all do what somebody else can, but we can do what God has designed us to do. Remember that everything that He's asked you to do, He's given you the strength to do it. And so we don't need to hear the voice of giants in our lives. We need to hear the voice of Jesus in our lives. So I hope that you're overcoming those comparisons. That leads us to a third one. Are you ready? Here goes the third question. What challenges did David receive when being compared with Saul? What was God's answer to all of David's challenges with comparisons? Remember this, that Saul was head and shoulders above everybody else. He was the people's choice. He was handsome. He was talented. He's what you would look for in a king, but he wasn't what God looked for in a king. You see, his heart was away from God. Yeah, he had some good qualities, but listen, compared to David's heart, he was nothing. And so that takes us full circle back to when David was chosen, and God told Samuel, it's the young lad. It's the less or the youngest of his brothers. And here's what he said, and please take this to heart today. This is the gist of our message. You need to hear this. It comes from 1 Samuel 16:7. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. That is Saul. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Boy, this is significant. Don't go doing comparisons of what you look like, what you have, what kind of talent, what kind of intelligence, what kind of popularity, what kind of wealth. You are not to look at that. God doesn't look at that. And even though the world tends to fall into that trap, we need to look at what God looks at. God looks at the heart. If you have a heart for God, you have a desire to serve God, everything that He's designed you to accomplish, He will accomplish through you. And listen, David, out of all those guys that were encamped there against the Philistines, he was the least to go out. But God accomplished what He wanted to through David, because David didn't struggle with insecurities. David had his confidence in God. That leads us to the last question. Question 4, how can you take God's response to Samuel regarding David and apply it to your life in order to overcome insecurity? So again, God says, man looks at the outside, God looks at the heart. We need to learn to understand that God made us unique, He made us special, He made us for a purpose, He made us for His purpose. And if we have a heart to fulfill that purpose, that's all God cares about. We need to stop comparing ourselves with other people and simply accept how God made us, how God designed us, and what God's call for our lives are. Listen, David's brothers looked like they were poised to go out and defeat. The tall, good-looking, handsome king was cowering in his tent. It was David, the least of these, who went out and defeated the Philistine. It was David who brought the kingdom together. It was David who built the temple. It was David who is described as being a man after God's own heart. Was he perfect? No, he wasn't. But he was confident in his God. I pray that you will be too. And I especially pray that you and I will be insecure no more. God bless. Thanks for joining me today.